AAA tranches have the strongest legal claim to the stream of income from the trust. And those at the bottom have the weakest claim, right? And so they set up this hierarchy of creditworthiness for different tranches. Now that's actually what was going on, right? It's not like they were rating Latino, unemployed Latino houses in East Los Angeles as AAA, and somehow this was some obviously perverted activity. They were essentially rating a trust and the products of a trust. Right? Most people don't know that, but it is actually quite different from what people think is going on. Now, you could say, well, they got ratings of trusts wrong, didn't they? And I think my response to that one is, well, Randall Germain, new book that's just come out on sort of global governance and financial markets, has referred to what he calls the Great Freeze of 2007, 2008. I call it the valuation crisis. This is, of course, the period in which actors in financial markets will not transact with each other. The LIBOR rate goes through the roof. Essentially, the markets stop. Now, if you think that you could insert that into a financial model that produces a credit rating, or indeed any financial model, good luck to you, right? Everybody missed this. The valuation crisis or Great Freeze of this time couldn't happen. Talk to Eugene Fama, impossible. Asset bubbles don't even exist for him. But certainly the sort of tsunami that we experienced at that time was not within the knowledge parameters of the market participants, of their academic commentators, and certainly their policy officials, regulators, and so on. Now, if you think that the rating agencies could have anticipated that, should have anticipated that, I'm afraid I would have to disagree with you. Nobody could, nobody did. So we had a tsunami. So guess what? That whole system of rating of trusts and the tranches associated with it ultimately came unstuck. But then it would, wouldn't it? And it seems to me that there is no. If you read and you talk to rating officials, and I have done this, there's no way they could possibly have got to this from 2006. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a reasonable position. And in any case, I mean, these are people who talk about a business cycle, who have a sense, have had a long sense by comparison with most financial market commentators of the comings and goings, of the rise and fall of different industries, the cyclic nature of many industries. But it doesn't extend that far, no. Because that's only something that I think probably one person at Moody's who was in his late 80s, a kind of chap who would come in half a day a week or something at that point, who had any memory of course, from the 1930s. Because your typical crisis of 87, your crisis in the early 70s, blah, 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 they're not this. Right? So I just think that is beyond human knowledge as reflected in what these people do. Okay, so just check the time, so what are the problems as I see it with credit rating agencies? And I think there are two roles that the agencies have that are the most substantive problems, if you like. Now the first is what I call conflict of role. The second is that the agencies work in reproducing what I call in my book the mental framework of orthodoxy, of the orthodox. The latter is probably something that is quite critical and difficult, but I think the former is a fairly easy concept. Now, it really is this, that we need the agencies to act as judges, right? Literally. We need them to impose a form of regulation, to be quite uncompromising, I suppose, in that, as a judge is. At the end of the day, they must make the judgments. Now, unfortunately, with asset-backed securities, that role of being a judge really fell apart, and the agencies became an advocate. So they crossed the bench, and they helped to actually constitute the securities or create or innovate the securities themselves. At this point, in the years prior to the crisis, the agencies are actually making the securities because they are the most experienced party in terms of advising essentially on legal matters, how to form a trust, how to create the tranches, all that sort of stuff. Okay. And it made a lot of sense for the participants in the market who are issuing these asset-backed securities to get this advice. You can see why they would do it. But to me, it really does challenge the role of a judge. And, I said earlier that Moody's and S&P were distinct from Fitch because they had more eminence, they had more epistemic authority, they had a better brand, they were considered more eminent. You go to Asia, you ask people, what do you think of your Japanese rating agencies? And they go, we like Moody's and S&P. You go to Malaysia, you ask them, what do you think of your Malaysian rating? We like Moody's and S&P. In other words, their local agencies are not very good. And the reason they're not very good is because of this. Because the agencies have this asset, they built up this, it's a major barrier to entry for other agencies. So when the agencies move to actually act on the other side of the bench to start creating essentially financial instruments, they really do imperil their franchise. They do imperil this. And I think, frankly, it's because they did this because most of them were trained as rationalists. They saw, there's an object-subject distinction. I'm here and I'm observing the financial markets. What they didn't appreciate was that actually much of what they do is founded on having this. And when you start imperiling that, and you start becoming a market maker as well as a market regulator, then you really cast that. And it really is because they didn't understand that, because the SEC didn't understand that, because most people don't perceive or conceive of financial markets in these terms. They have a rationalist conception of it as one would of the physical universe. But actually, it is this authority that really was the thing that they blew up. And I think that is what they need to get back, and they need to therefore play the role that they were set up to play. In a sense, they shot themselves in the foot. Now, my second objection is more systemically critical. You might interpret this as sort of the macro-prudential moment in the talk, if you will. I quite like that macro. We had a nice macro-prudential moment, didn't we, a couple of years ago? Seems to have passed. But it was nice. But I'm going to continue with it. My concern is not that the agencies... See, my concern is not... I guess, here we are in the seminar, right? I don't think the problem really, ultimately, is that the agencies have been the wrong part in the car, or the part's broken or something. I don't think that's the problem, really, here. But, the seminar does imply, that we take the part out, we put a new part in, the new part's better than the old part, and everything works fine. Now, at some level. Now, I think that really isn't the problem here. My concern is that the agencies really, in the broadest sense, have, and I talk about this in the book, of course, they've helped to reproduce what I call an historically and geographically specific model of finance capitalism. Right, call it what you will. Some people use neoliberalism. Some people call it all sorts of things, which I can't repeat and get my tongue around, but let's call it a historically and geographically specific model of finance capitalism that we know in the West. This model, of course, has a tendency to extreme financial innovation, recurrent asset price bubbles. Ask any realtor in the United States. The market's up, the market's down, we're having a crisis. Anybody who's ever been to Texas, you'll see the concrete pads. I think this features in one of Neil Ferguson's documentaries. You see the remnants of these asset bubbles in terms of concrete pads. In a few years' time, you'll see that in Ireland too, because all those buildings that are up there right now, they'll have burnt out and all be left as a concrete pad underneath. Now that, it seems to me, has left us with a legacy of debt, a legacy of social conflict that is going to take decades potentially to resolve. And that seems to me really to be the problem here. okay, there is the kind of there is the narrower problem. This is the broader problem. This is the problem I think really that I get excited about, because it's, you know, this is, the problem really isn't that the agencies don't do their job. It's the problem is that they're actually too narrow in terms of the role that they take, right? And this is where, of course, you get into principal agent theory, and you say, oh, you know, they should be acting as a very narrow agent for their principals and all that sort of stuff. Well, I would say to you, no. That's how we get this, that's how we get this, and that's how we get those concrete pads in Texas and in Ireland, right? What we need instead, I think, is a different model of principal-agent relations. Well, maybe we have to perhaps move to a stakeholder model of that. I'll talk about that. Okay, so let me finish off. First of all, these are very obscure institutions. When I started doing them, nobody knew what they were. Everybody knows now. I think this process of disintermediation is the key thing. We have banks on the high street that are not really banks anymore. When I first walked into Citibank in London in 1992, I was welcomed to Citibank, we don't lend money here. And I think that's the fundamental underlying process here that we need to get our heads around. Many of the objections to the work of the agencies, I think, are problematic and don't actually work, and are, in a sense, moral panics. The agencies have become a useful target for the failures of the last 3 years. Third point is that the sheer complexity, and this is where I don't blame the individuals at Moody's and S&P, but I think the sheer complexity of financial innovation coming out of that process of disintermediation has challenged their valued role as judge. They need to move back to that role as judge. They need to abandon the role as advocate. But in my view, the best judges, this is where we try to make it all work, in my view, a really good judge is not the sort of pedantic type, but is actually the type of judge who is able to see things, see the law and see a legal case in the broader context. And I think that's precisely what is missing in the historical model of the rating agencies, and what we really need to have them evolve to. That is to take back the role of the judge, yes, but not to take back the role of the pedantic, sort of legalistic judge, if for want of a better word, but to take on the role of the judge who actually does insert some sense of social responsibility or social policy into their judgments, and such judges do exist in this country today and have been lauded as legal giants in decades past in this country and elsewhere. And this is precisely the role of the Supreme Court in the United States, it seems to me. And I think we need to, so we need to evolve beyond, in a sense, we need to evolve beyond the sort of narrow auto parts sort of conception of the agencies to a conception of them taking a much more sort of governing role, a much more productive and creative role. Now, I mean, it's ironic to sort of finish on this note because, of course, that's a very ambitious role, but it seems to me that the actual narrow role leads back into the world of financial destruction that we've just come out of. Thank you.